What happens when a man loses everything and discovers he has nothing left to fear? In the shadows of colonial power, where human lives were traded like cattle and justice belonged only to those who could afford it, one man's story would rewrite the rules of retribution. This isn't just a tale of revenge. It's a chilling reminder that every action, no matter how buried in bureaucracy and privilege, eventually finds its way back to the surface. If stories of justice, power, and the human spirit captivate you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because today's story will stay with you long after it ends. The morning mist clung to the tobacco fields like the breath of ghosts, and Samuel knew, though he couldn't yet name the feeling, that this would be the last dawn he'd see his children's faces. He was 28 years old, though no official record would ever acknowledge his birth. His hands, scarred from 15 years of fieldwork, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared for another day under Governor Harrison Blackwood's dominion. The plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Virginia soil, a monument to wealth built on the backs of 200 enslaved souls. Samuel's wife, Mercy, hummed softly as she braided their daughter's hair. Little Rose, barely 6, giggled as her mother's gentle fingers worked through the tangles. Their son, Thomas, 8 years old, with eyes that held too much understanding for his age, sat quietly mending a torn shirt, a skill he'd learned from watching his father repair the endless damage that came with their lives. "Papa," Rose whispered, tugging at Samuel's worn cotton shirt. "Why does Master Blackwood look at us like that?" Samuel's hands stilled. He'd noticed it too, the way the governor's pale blue eyes lingered on his family during the weekly inspections, the way his thin lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Harrison Blackwood was a man who collected beautiful things, fine horses, rare books, and people who caught his particular attention. "Don't you worry about Master Blackwood, little Rose," Samuel said, lifting his daughter onto his lap. "You just keep being the bright light you are." But worry had already taken root in Samuel's chest, growing like a tumor he couldn't cut out. The Blackwood plantation operated with the cold efficiency of a machine. Every morning at 5, the bell would ring, calling the enslaved workers to another day of backbreaking labor. Every evening at sunset, they would return to their quarters, small wooden structures that housed entire families, in spaces barely large enough for livestock. Samuel had built their cabin himself, using skills learned from his own father before the family was separated and sold to different masters. The structure was modest but sturdy, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace that provided warmth during Virginia's harsh winters, and a small loft where the children slept on straw mattresses that Mercy had sewn from scraps of burlap. Despite the poverty, Mercy had made it a home. Wildflowers picked from the edges of the fields brightened the single room, and the smell of whatever meager meal she could prepare filled the space with warmth and love. It was in this cabin that Samuel's family found their only moments of true peace. After the day's labor was done, after the overseer's whip had been put away and the master's demands had been met, they would gather around their small table and pretend, for just a few precious hours, that they were free. Thomas would practice his letters, scratching them into the dirt floor with a stick, while Samuel watched nervously for any sign that someone might discover his son's illegal education. Rose would play with a corn-husk doll that Mercy had made, creating elaborate stories about princesses and castles that existed only in her imagination. And Mercy would sing, softly, carefully, songs that her own grandmother had taught her, melodies that carried the pain and hope of generations. Governor Blackwood himself was a different breed of master than most. Where other plantation owners ruled through raw brutality, Blackwood preferred psychological control. He was educated, articulate, and possessed a lawyer's understanding of exactly how far he could push without breaking the laws that, theoretically, offered some protection to his human property. The key to managing slaves, he often told his dinner guests, swirling brandy in crystal glasses, is to make them believe they have something to lose. And Samuel's family had become his favorite example of that philosophy. Blackwood had inherited the plantation from his father, along with a philosophy of control that had been refined over 3 generations. The first Blackwood had been a crude man who ruled through fear and violence. The second had added a veneer of civilization. learning to mask his cruelty behind legal language and social respectability. But Harrison Blackwood had perfected the art of psychological manipulation, understanding that a slave who believed he had earned his master's favor was far more valuable than one who simply feared his master's wrath. Samuel's family represented the pinnacle of this strategy. They were living proof that good behavior could be rewarded, that loyalty could be recognized, that even slaves could aspire to something better than mere survival. Other enslaved families looked at Samuel's modest privileges, the slightly larger cabin, the occasional extra rations, the permission for his children to play in the yard near the main house, and saw hope for their own futures. What they didn't see was the trap that those privileges represented, the invisible chains that bound Samuel's family more securely than any iron shackles ever could. It started with small privileges: better food for the children, a slightly larger cabin, permission for Mercy to tend the governor's garden instead of working the fields. Each kindness came with a price that wasn't immediately apparent, a debt that would eventually be called in. "Samuel," Mercy whispered one night as they lay on their thin mattress, listening to their children's steady breathing, "I don't like the way he watches Rose." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd seen it too, the way Blackwood's attention lingered on their daughter's developing features, the way he found excuses to have her brought to the main house for trivial tasks. "I know," Samuel replied, his voice barely audible. "I'm thinking." But what could a man think when he owned nothing, not even himself? What plans could he make when every law, every institution, every armed man for 100 miles served the interests of people like Harrison Blackwood? The answer came 3 days later, delivered by Blackwood's overseer, a cruel man named Jeremiah Colt, whose face bore the permanent sneer of someone who enjoyed his work too much. "Governor wants to see you," Colt announced, his hand resting casually on the whip at his belt. "Alone." Samuel found Blackwood in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and hunting trophies. The governor sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, his pale fingers steepled as he regarded Samuel with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. The study itself was a monument to Blackwood's education and refinement. First-edition volumes of Shakespeare and Milton shared shelf space with treatises on agriculture and law. A globe of the world sat in one corner, its brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight, while maps of Virginia and the surrounding states covered one wall. The room smelled of tobacco, leather, and the particular mustiness that came from old money and older secrets. "Samuel," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Virginia aristocracy, "you've been with us for 15 years. Faithful service, reliable work. I appreciate that." Samuel remained silent, knowing that any response could be twisted into insubordination. "Your family," Blackwood continued, "they're quite remarkable. Your wife has such gentle hands with the flowers. Your son shows real intelligence, perhaps too much for his own good. And your daughter." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. "She's becoming quite beautiful." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, but he kept his expression neutral. Survival had taught him to hide his emotions behind a mask of compliance. "I've been thinking," Blackwood said, rising from his chair and moving to the window that overlooked the slave quarters, "about the future, about legacy, about the kind of arrangements that might benefit us both." Samuel's hands clenched into fists behind his back, but his voice remained steady. "What arrangements, Master Blackwood? Your daughter will be of age soon, old enough to serve in the main house, old enough to learn new skills." Blackwood's reflection in the window showed a smile that made Samuel's stomach turn. "I'm prepared to offer your family certain protections in exchange for her cooperation." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Samuel understood perfectly what was being proposed, and he understood equally well that refusal wasn't really an option. Men like Blackwood didn't make requests. They made offers that were designed to sound like choices while being anything but. "I need time to discuss this with my wife," Samuel said carefully. Blackwood turned from the window, his pale eyes glittering with amusement. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But remember, Samuel, I'm offering you a choice here. Not everyone gets choices." That night, Samuel told Mercy everything. They held each other in the darkness, their children sleeping peacefully beside them, and made the only decision that their hearts would allow. They would run. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation. The Underground Railroad had routes through Virginia, though finding them meant risking everything on the hope that strangers would help, rather than turn them in for the bounty money. But the alternative, watching their daughter disappear into the main house, knowing what awaited her there, was unthinkable. They planned for 2 weeks, gathering supplies in tiny increments, memorizing the stories of other families who had attempted escape. Samuel used his position as a skilled carpenter to learn the patrol schedules, the locations of safe houses, the names whispered in the darkness by those who had tried and failed. Samuel had learned carpentry from his father back when his family had been whole, before the debts and the auction block had scattered them to the winds. It was a skill that made him valuable to Blackwood, valuable enough to earn small privileges and the illusion of security. Now he used that same skill to plan their escape, studying the construction of buildings and fences, learning which routes would provide cover and which would expose them to the patrols that hunted runaway slaves with dogs and guns. The Underground Railroad was more myth than reality to most slaves. A whispered hope passed from mouth to mouth in the darkness of the quarters. But Samuel had heard enough stories, gathered enough fragments of information to believe that it existed. There were Quakers in the northern counties who opposed slavery on religious grounds. There were free blacks who risked their own liberty to help others find freedom. There were even some whites who, for reasons of conscience or politics, were willing to aid escaping slaves. The challenge was making contact with these networks without exposing themselves to the far more numerous slave catchers, bounty hunters, and informants who made their living from human misery. On a moonless night in October, they made their move. They almost succeeded. The dogs found them 18 miles from the plantation, huddled in the abandoned tobacco barn with their children clutched against their chests. Samuel heard the baying first, a sound that turned his blood to ice water, and he knew their brief taste of freedom was over. They had made it farther than Samuel had dared to hope. For 3 days, they had moved through the Virginia countryside like ghosts, traveling by night and hiding during the day. They had followed creek beds to mask their scent, avoided roads where patrols might spot them, and lived on the meager supplies they had been able to gather without arousing suspicion. Rose had been brave beyond her years, never complaining about the cold or the hunger or the fear that radiated from her parents like heat from a fire. Thomas had helped carry their few possessions, his young face set with a determination that broke Samuel's heart. And Mercy had been their anchor, whispering encouragement when despair threatened to overwhelm them, singing softly to the children when they needed comfort. For 3 precious days they had been free. They had walked under open skies, breathed air that belonged to no master, made decisions based on their own will rather than another man's commands. Samuel had allowed himself to imagine a future where his children could learn to read without fear, where his wife could tend her own garden, where he could work for wages instead of the lash. But freedom, Samuel learned, was a luxury that men like Governor Blackwood would never allow people like him to enjoy. The abandoned tobacco barn, where they had taken shelter for their final night of freedom, had seemed like a godsend. It was far from any main road, hidden in a grove of oak trees that provided cover from prying eyes. The roof was mostly intact, offering protection from the October rain that had begun to fall as darkness settled over the countryside. Samuel should have known it was too good to be true, should have recognized that such obvious shelter would be watched, that slave catchers knew all the places where desperate families might seek refuge. Jeremiah Colt arrived with 6 armed men and a pack of bloodhounds whose eyes gleamed red in the torchlight. The overseer's face wore an expression of savage satisfaction as he surveyed the captured family. "Well, well," Colt drawled, his voice thick with malicious pleasure. "Look what we got here, the governor's favorite family playing at being free folks." The men with Colt were a mixture of plantation overseers, professional slave catchers, and local farmers who supplemented their income by hunting human beings for bounty money. They were armed with rifles, pistols, and whips, their faces hard with the casual cruelty of men who had learned to see enslaved people as livestock rather than human beings. The dogs strained against their leashes, their powerful bodies quivering with barely contained violence. These were not pets or hunting companions. They were weapons, bred and trained specifically for tracking and attacking runaway slaves. Their handlers kept them hungry and aggressive, rewarding them with meat when they successfully brought down their human prey. Samuel stepped protectively in front of Mercy and the children, though he knew the gesture was futile. "Please," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Punish me. Leave them be." Colt's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Oh, you'll all be punished, boy. But first, we're going back to have a conversation with Governor Blackwood. He's been waiting up for you." The journey back to the plantation passed in a blur of forced marching and whispered prayers. Rose cried silently against her mother's shoulder, while Thomas walked with the grim determination of a boy who understood that childhood had just ended forever. They were bound with ropes that cut into their wrists, connected by a chain that ensured they could not run even if an opportunity presented itself. The men took turns riding alongside them on horseback, their weapons always visible, their threats always implicit. When Rose stumbled from exhaustion, one of the slave catchers kicked her back to her feet with casual brutality. "Keep moving, little girl," the man said with a grin that showed missing teeth. "Your master's waiting and he don't like to be kept waiting." Samuel wanted to kill that man with his bare hands, wanted to tear out his throat and watch the life drain from his eyes. But the chains held him fast and the guns ensured his compliance. All he could do was help his daughter to her feet and whisper words of comfort that felt like lies in his mouth. The plantation appeared before them like a vision of hell, its windows glowing with lamplight in the pre-dawn darkness. Samuel could see figures moving on the veranda of the main house, Governor Blackwood and his household, waiting to witness the return of their wayward property. Governor Blackwood was waiting in the main courtyard, flanked by a dozen armed men. His pale face showed no emotion as the captured family was forced to their knees before him, but Samuel could see the cold fury burning in his eyes. The governor was dressed in his finest clothes, as if the recapture of his escaped slaves was a formal occasion worthy of ceremony. His coat was perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his silver hair combed back with mathematical precision. He looked like what he was, a man of wealth and power, secure in his authority and confident in his right to dispose of human lives as he saw fit. 15 years, Blackwood said, his cultured voice cutting through the night air like a blade. 15 years of food, shelter, protection. "And this is how you repay my generosity?" Samuel raised his head, meeting the governor's gaze directly for the first time in his life. "We repay it by being human beings who want to live free." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Samuel saw something shift in Blackwood's expression, a flicker of genuine surprise that a slave would dare speak such truth to power. Around the courtyard, the other enslaved people of the plantation had been forced to watch. They stood in silent rows, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes reflecting the terror and helplessness that came from witnessing the fate that awaited anyone who dared to dream of freedom. Samuel could see children among them, some no older than Rose, learning the lesson that Blackwood intended to teach. Human beings. Blackwood repeated slowly as if tasting the words. "How interesting. Tell me, Samuel, do human beings steal? Do they break contracts? Do they bite the hand that feeds them?" "Do human beings own other human beings?" Samuel replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Do they buy and sell children? Do they—" The blow from Colt's fist sent Samuel sprawling in the dirt, blood streaming from his split lip. Mercy screamed, lunging forward to help her husband, but rough hands dragged her back. "Enough," Blackwood said quietly, and the courtyard fell silent. "I offered you a choice, Samuel, a reasonable arrangement that would have benefited everyone. Instead, you chose theft. You chose to steal my property, yourself, your wife, your children, and flee in the night like common criminals." Samuel struggled to his knees, spitting blood. "We chose freedom." "You chose consequences," Blackwood corrected, "and consequences, I'm afraid, must be educational." What happened next would haunt Samuel's dreams for the rest of his life, though those dreams would be mercifully brief. Blackwood's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as he pronounced sentence. "The penalty for theft of this magnitude, according to Virginia law, is death. However, I am not without mercy. Samuel, you will watch your family pay the price for your choices. Then you will join them." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No. Take me, kill me, leave them alone." But Blackwood had already turned away, nodding to his men. "Make it quick for the children," he said, as if discussing the weather. "They are, after all, innocent of their father's crimes." What followed was a nightmare of screaming and gunshots, of small bodies falling and a mother's final cry of anguish. Samuel fought against the hands holding him, fought until his voice was raw from screaming, fought until the world dissolved into a red haze of grief and rage. The executions were carried out with military precision. 3 men stepped forward with rifles, their faces showing no emotion, as they took aim at the kneeling figures of Mercy, Rose, and Thomas. The children clung to their mother, their small faces buried against her chest, while she whispered final words of love and comfort. "I love you," Mercy called to Samuel, her voice carrying across the courtyard despite the chaos. "I love you, and I forgive you, and I'll be waiting." The gunshots cut off her words, 3 sharp cracks that echoed off the buildings and seemed to reverberate through Samuel's very soul. His family crumpled to the ground like broken dolls, their blood pooling in the Virginia dirt, their dreams and hopes and futures extinguished in an instant. Samuel's screams turned into something inhuman, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. He fought against his captors with superhuman strength, driven by grief and rage beyond all reason, until finally they struck him down with the butts of their rifles. When it was over, when the courtyard fell silent except for Samuel's broken sobs, Blackwood approached him one final time. "You wanted to teach them about freedom," the governor said softly. "Instead, you taught them about the price of defying the natural order. I hope the lesson was worth it." The bullet that should have ended Samuel's suffering never came. Instead, Blackwood made a different choice, one that would prove to be his greatest mistake. "Bury them," he ordered his men, "all of them, in the slave cemetery, unmarked graves. And Samuel—" He paused, studying the broken man kneeling in his family's blood. "Samuel will dig the graves himself. Then he'll work until he dies, carrying the knowledge of what his choices cost." It was meant to be a fate worse than death, a living hell that would serve as an example to every other slave on the plantation. Blackwood wanted Samuel to suffer, to break completely, to become a walking reminder of what happened to those who dared dream of freedom. But Blackwood had made a critical error in his calculations. He had left Samuel alive. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. Samuel dug the graves with his bare hands, his tears mixing with the Virginia soil as he laid his family to rest. He whispered their names into the darkness: Mercy, Rose, Thomas, committing every detail of their faces to memory, every word they had ever spoken, every moment of joy they had shared. The slave cemetery was a desolate place, marked only by rough wooden crosses and the occasional stone marker. It was where the plantation's human property was laid to rest, when their usefulness ended, their bodies returning to the earth that had claimed their labor in life. Samuel's family joined the dozens of other souls who had lived and died in bondage, their graves indistinguishable from those of strangers. As he covered their bodies with earth, something fundamental changed inside him, the part of Samuel that had been capable of hope, of love, of mercy. That part died with his family. What remained was something harder, colder, and infinitely more patient. The other slaves watched him with a mixture of pity and fear. Some tried to offer comfort, but Samuel had moved beyond the reach of human consolation. He worked in silence, ate in silence, slept in silence. To the casual observer, he appeared to be exactly what Blackwood had intended, a broken man, crushed by the weight of his choices. But in the depths of Samuel's silence, something was growing. Not hope. Hope was for people who still had something to lose. This was something else entirely. This was the cold, patient fury of a man who had found his purpose in the ashes of his old life. Samuel began to watch, to listen, to learn. He observed the routines of the main house, the schedules of the guards, the habits of the family. He memorized the names of Blackwood's wife, his 3 children, his elderly mother who lived in the East Wing. He learned which servants could be trusted, which could be bought, which could be frightened into cooperation. Most importantly, he learned to wait. Months passed, then years. Samuel became a ghost, haunting the plantation, present but invisible, working but never truly seen. The other slaves began to forget that he had ever been anything other than the silent, broken man who tended the gardens and repaired the buildings with mechanical precision. But Samuel remembered everything. He remembered the sound of his daughter's laughter. He remembered the feel of his wife's hand in his. He remembered the weight of his son's small body as he carried him to bed. And he remembered the promise he had made over their graves, a promise that Governor Harrison Blackwood would learn, in time, the true meaning of consequences. 5 years had passed since the night Samuel's world ended, and in that time, he had become something unprecedented on the Blackwood plantation, invisible. Not invisible in the way that slaves were typically overlooked by their masters, but truly invisible, a man who had learned to move through the world like smoke, present but unnoticed, essential but unremarked upon. Governor Blackwood had long since stopped thinking about Samuel as anything more than a useful tool. The broken man who tended the gardens, repaired the buildings, and maintained the grounds had become part of the plantation's infrastructure, as unremarkable and reliable as the water pump or the tobacco barns. This was exactly what Samuel had cultivated, and it had taken him years to perfect. During those 5 years, Samuel had mapped every inch of the plantation with the precision of a military strategist. He knew which floorboards creaked in the main house, which windows could be opened silently, which servants' schedules could be predicted to the minute. He had learned the sleeping patterns of every member of the Blackwood family, their fears, their weaknesses, their secrets. The transformation had been gradual but deliberate. In the months following his family's murder, Samuel had allowed his grief to show just enough to satisfy Blackwood's expectations. He had appeared broken, defeated, a man whose spirit had been crushed beyond repair. The other slaves had watched him with pity. The overseers had dismissed him as harmless, and the Blackwood family had forgotten he existed. But beneath the surface, Samuel had been studying, learning, planning. He had taught himself to read by stealing discarded newspapers and studying the letters carved into tombstones in the family cemetery. He had learned about poisons by observing the plantation's herb garden and questioning the elderly slaves who remembered folk remedies from their African ancestors. He had studied human nature by watching the interactions between masters and servants, learning to recognize the tells that revealed fear, guilt, and weakness. Most importantly, he had learned patience. The governor's household consisted of his wife, Margaret, a frail woman who suffered from chronic headaches and relied heavily on laudanum for relief. Their eldest son, Harrison Jr., 22 years old and already showing signs of his father's casual cruelty. Their daughter, Elizabeth, 19, and engaged to the son of a neighboring plantation owner. And their youngest, Michael, barely 16, but already being groomed to inherit his father's empire of human misery. Samuel knew them all intimately, though none of them could have picked him out of a crowd of field hands. Margaret Blackwood was a woman trapped by her own privilege, raised to be ornamental rather than useful, educated just enough to manage a household, but not enough to question the system that sustained her comfort. She spent her days in a haze of laudanum and melancholy, reading romantic novels and writing letters to distant relatives who rarely replied. Her headaches were real enough. The stress of maintaining her position in society, while ignoring the suffering that surrounded her, had taken its toll, but the medicine she used to treat them had become an addiction that ruled her life. Samuel had observed her routines for years, noting how she increased her dosage when the screams from the slave quarters grew too loud, how she retreated to her room when visitors asked uncomfortable questions about the plantation's operations. She was not evil in the way her husband was evil. She was simply weak, complicit through inaction rather than malice. Harrison Jr. was a different creature entirely. Where his father's cruelty was calculated and controlled, the young man's sadism was impulsive and theatrical. He had inherited his father's sense of entitlement, but none of his intelligence, making him dangerous in the way that stupid, powerful people always were. Samuel had watched him torture small animals as a child, graduate to tormenting slaves as a teenager, and now, as a young man, He was developing appetites that made even his father uncomfortable. The gambling debts were just the latest symptom of Harrison Jr., his fundamental weakness. He had been caught cheating at cards in Richmond, had borrowed money from dangerous men to cover his losses, and was now stealing from the plantation's accounts to service debts that grew larger every month. Samuel had discovered this by reading correspondence that the young man carelessly left lying around, letters that revealed the full extent of his financial desperation. Elizabeth Blackwood was perhaps the most tragic figure in the household. Unlike her mother's willful blindness or her brother's active cruelty, Elizabeth seemed genuinely troubled by the suffering she witnessed. Samuel had seen her slip food to hungry slave children, had watched her flinch when the whip cracked in the fields, had observed her tears when families were separated at auction. But her compassion was constrained by her circumstances. She was a woman in a world that gave women no power, a moral person trapped in an immoral system, someone who could see the evil around her but lacked the courage or ability to oppose it. Her nightmares were the price she paid for her conscience, and her midnight walks were attempts to escape the guilt that haunted her waking hours. Young Michael was the most innocent of the family, though Samuel knew that innocence would not last. The boy had been sheltered from the worst aspects of plantation life, educated by private tutors, who taught him to see slavery as a natural and necessary institution. His weak heart was both a blessing and a curse. It kept him from the physical activities that might have hardened him like his older brother, but it also made him dependent on medication that could be easily manipulated. Samuel knew all of this because he had made it his business to know. For 5 years he had been the perfect slave, obedient, reliable, invisible. And in return, the Blackwood family had given him access to their lives, their routines, their vulnerabilities. The plantation itself had become Samuel's laboratory. He knew every building, every path, every hiding place. He had identified the locations where accidents might plausibly occur, where evidence could be disposed of, where alibis could be established. He had cultivated relationships with key servants, learning their loyalties and their prices, understanding which ones could be trusted and which ones posed threats. Martha, the elderly cook, had become his most valuable ally, though she didn't yet know it. She had worked in the main house for 30 years, had seen 3 generations of Blackwoods come and go, and had developed the kind of institutional knowledge that made her indispensable. More importantly, she remembered Samuel's family with genuine affection, and her guilt over their deaths had made her receptive to his subtle influence. There was also James, the stable master, whose son had been sold away 5 years earlier to pay for Harrison Jr.'s gambling debts. The man's grief had curdled into a quiet hatred that Samuel recognized and could exploit. And Sarah, the housemaid, whose sister had died from an infected whipping, and who now moved through the main house like a ghost, seeing everything and saying nothing. These were Samuel's tools, though they didn't know it yet. People whose pain could be channeled, whose loyalty could be purchased with the promise of justice, whose silence could be ensured through shared complicity. Now, as autumn painted the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel judged that the time for waiting was finally over. The plan that had taken shape in his mind was not one of sudden violence or dramatic confrontation. Samuel had learned from his master's own methods. The most effective destruction came not from explosive force, but from the patient application of pressure at precisely the right points. He began with the servants. Martha, the elderly cook who had worked in the main house for 30 years, had always been kind to Samuel. She remembered his family, had wept quietly at their funeral, and had occasionally slipped him extra food during the darkest months of his grief. Samuel approached her carefully, knowing that her loyalty to the Blackwood family ran deep. "Martha," he said one evening as she prepared dinner in the kitchen, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me." The old woman looked up from her preparations, her weathered face creasing with concern. "Samuel, child, what's troubling you?" The kitchen was Martha's domain, a place where she had reigned supreme for 3 decades. The massive fireplace dominated one wall, its iron pots and kettles hanging like instruments of some ancient ritual. Shelves lined the other walls, filled with jars of preserves, sacks of flour and sugar, and the countless implements needed to feed a household of 20 people. The air was thick with the smell of bread baking and soup simmering, the comfortable aromas of a place where food was transformed into sustenance. But tonight, the kitchen felt different. Tonight, it felt like a place where conspiracies were born. "Do you remember my Rose?" Samuel asked quietly. Martha's hand stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. "Course I remember her. Sweet little thing. Broke my heart when—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "She would have been 11 now," Samuel continued, his voice steady but his eyes burning with controlled intensity. "Old enough to help in the kitchen. Old enough to learn to read, maybe, if she'd been born free. Samuel, you can't be thinking like this. It'll drive you mad." "I'm not mad, Martha. I'm clear. Clearer than I've ever been." Samuel moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm going to ask you to do something for me. Something that might seem wrong, but I need you to trust that it's justice." Martha set down her knife, her hands trembling slightly. "What are you asking me to do?" Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small vial of clear liquid. "This is digitalis extract. Concentrated. Young Master Michael takes it for his heart condition, but too much." He let the implication hang in the air. "Samuel, no." Martha backed away from him, her eyes wide with horror. "I can't. I won't. They killed my children, Martha. They killed my wife. They made me dig their graves and then went to bed that night like nothing had happened." Samuel's voice remained calm, but Martha could see the abyss of pain behind his eyes. "I'm not asking you to murder anyone. I'm asking you to help me serve justice." "This isn't justice, child. This is revenge." "What's the difference?" Samuel asked. "When the law protects the guilty and condemns the innocent, when the courts serve only those who can afford them, when justice is bought and sold like tobacco, what's the difference between revenge and justice?" Martha stared at him for a long moment, seeing not the broken slave she had pitied for 5 years, but something else entirely, something that frightened and awed her in equal measure. "If I do this," she whispered, "if I help you, what happens to the rest of us? What happens when they find out?" "They won't find out," Samuel said with quiet certainty, "because it won't look like murder. It will look like tragedy. A series of unfortunate accidents. A family cursed by fate." Over the next hour, Samuel laid out his plan in careful detail. It was elegant in its simplicity, terrifying in its thoroughness. Each death would appear natural, accidental, or at worst, the result of random violence from unknown assailants. There would be no evidence pointing back to the plantation's slaves, no reason for suspicion to fall on the very people who had the most cause to hate the Blackwood family. The plan relied on intimate knowledge of each family member's routines, weaknesses, and fears. Michael's heart condition made him vulnerable to what would appear to be a natural death. Harrison Jr., his gambling debts and reckless behavior created opportunities for staged accidents or attacks by creditors. Elizabeth's midnight walks exposed her to dangers that could be manipulated. Margaret's laudanum addiction provided a perfect cover for an overdose, and Governor Blackwood himself. Governor Blackwood would be saved for last, when he was alone and defenseless, when he could be made to understand exactly why his family was dying. "You've been planning this for 5 years," Martha said when he finished, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Every day," Samuel confirmed. "Every moment since I covered my daughter's face with dirt." Martha was quiet for a long time, staring at the vial in Samuel's hand. Finally she spoke. "That little girl, Rose, she used to help me in the kitchen sometimes, always wanted to learn to make biscuits like her mama." "I remember. She deserved better than what this world gave her. Yes, she did." Martha reached out and took the vial from Samuel's hand. "God forgive me," she whispered. "God forgive us both." The first death came 3 days later. Young Michael Blackwood collapsed during dinner, clutching his chest and gasping for air. The family physician was summoned immediately, but there was nothing to be done. The boy's weak heart had finally given out, overwhelmed by what appeared to be a massive cardiac episode. The funeral was held on a grey October morning, attended by the cream of Virginia society. Governor Blackwood stood stoic and dry-eyed beside his wife's sobbing form, accepting condolences with the dignity expected of a man of his station. Samuel watched from a distance, standing among the other slaves who had been permitted to attend the service. He felt no satisfaction at the sight of the small coffin being lowered into the ground, only a cold sense of completion, like a debt being marked as paid. 1 down, 4 to go. The second death came 2 weeks later, and it appeared to be nothing more than a tragic accident. Harrison Blackwood Jr. was found at the bottom of the main staircase, his neck broken from what seemed to be a fatal fall. The stairs were known to be treacherous, especially in the early morning hours when the light was poor. The young man had been drinking heavily the night before, a fact confirmed by several witnesses, and it was easy to conclude that he had simply missed his footing in the darkness. What the investigators didn't know was that Samuel had spent weeks studying those stairs, learning exactly how much pressure applied to exactly the right spot would cause a person to lose their balance. They didn't know about the thin wire that had been stretched across the 7th step for precisely 30 seconds, long enough for Harrison Jr. to catch his foot and tumble to his death, short enough to be removed before anyone thought to look for it. The wire had been fashioned from materials found in the plantation's workshop, twisted and shaped, with the same skills Samuel had used to repair countless pieces of equipment over the years. It was strong enough to trip a man, but thin enough to be nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. Samuel had practiced the timing dozens of times, learning to string and remove the wire in a matter of seconds, leaving no trace of his presence. The Blackwood family was devastated. 2 sons dead in less than a month. Margaret Blackwood's laudanum consumption increased dramatically, and Governor Blackwood himself began to show signs of strain. The man who had always prided himself on his control was starting to crack under the weight of grief and fear. Samuel watched it all with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. He felt no joy in their suffering, but no pity either. They were simply obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved, debts to be collected. The third death was the most carefully orchestrated of all. Elizabeth Blackwood had always been a restless sleeper, prone to walking the halls when nightmares plagued her dreams. Samuel had observed this pattern for years, noting the routes she took, the times she was most likely to venture outside. On a moonless night in November, Elizabeth left the main house for one of her midnight walks, seeking relief from dreams that had grown increasingly violent since her brother's deaths. She walked toward the old oak tree where she often sat to think, unaware that she was being watched by eyes that had memorized her every movement. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Elizabeth's screams echoed across the plantation for less than 30 seconds before they were cut short. When her body was discovered the next morning, it bore the marks of what appeared to be a random assault by unknown assailants, possibly escaped slaves or bandits who had targeted the plantation. Samuel had studied the patterns of violence that plagued the Virginia countryside, learning how to replicate the signatures of different types of attacks. He knew which wounds would suggest desperate slaves seeking revenge, which would point to bandits looking for easy targets, which would indicate random violence by drifters passing through the area. Elizabeth's death was staged to look like the work of escaped slaves, angry, desperate men who had targeted her for the simple crime of being a Blackwood. The evidence was carefully planted, footprints that suggested multiple attackers, signs of a struggle that indicated she had tried to run, wounds that spoke of rage rather than calculation. Governor Blackwood's response was immediate and vicious. He ordered brutal interrogations of every slave on the plantation, convinced that the attack had been carried out by his own property. Samuel submitted to the questioning with the same stoic silence he had maintained for 5 years, showing no emotion as Jeremiah Colt's whip opened fresh wounds on his back. But the investigation yielded nothing. No evidence, no confessions, no leads. Elizabeth Blackwood had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of the random violence that plagued the Virginia countryside. Samuel knew better, of course. He had been the violence in the darkness, the hand that had silenced Elizabeth's screams. But he also knew that no one would ever suspect the broken slave who had endured his own interrogation with such passive resignation. 3 down, 2 to go. As winter settled over the plantation, Samuel began to prepare for the final phase of his plan. The deaths of Margaret and Governor Blackwood would need to be perfect, not just undetectable but poetic. They would need to understand, in their final moments, exactly why they were dying, and who was responsible. Samuel had waited 5 years for this moment. He could wait a little longer to make sure it was done right. After all, some debts were worth taking the time to collect properly. Winter had transformed the Blackwood plantation into a landscape of death and silence. The once proud estate now felt like a mausoleum, its halls echoing with the ghosts of 3 dead children and the whispered fears of those who remained. Governor Harrison Blackwood had aged a decade in the span of 3 months. His silver hair had turned white. Deep lines had carved themselves around his pale blue eyes, and his hands shook with a tremor that no amount of brandy could still. The man who had once ruled his domain with absolute authority now jumped at shadows and saw threats in every corner. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Blackwood had always prided himself on his composure, his ability to maintain control even in the most challenging circumstances. He was a man who had built his fortune on the calculated exploitation of human misery, who had learned to sleep soundly despite the screams that echoed from the slave quarters. But the deaths of his children had shattered something fundamental in his psyche, revealing the frightened, paranoid creature that lurked beneath his aristocratic facade. Samuel observed these changes with the clinical detachment of a physician monitoring a patient's decline. Every tremor in Blackwood's hands, every sleepless night, every moment of terror was a small payment on the debt that was finally coming due. Margaret Blackwood had retreated almost entirely into her laudanum-induced haze, spending her days in a darkened bedroom, speaking to children who were no longer there. The servants whispered that she was losing her mind, but Samuel knew better. She wasn't losing her mind. She was drowning in guilt, suffocating under the weight of sins that had finally come home to roost. The woman who had once presided over elegant dinner parties and charity functions now rarely left her room. When she did venture out, it was with the uncertain gait of someone who was no longer sure what was real and what was hallucination. She would call out to Michael in the garden, forgetting that he was dead. She would set places at the dinner table for Harrison Jr. and Elizabeth, then weep when they failed to appear. The laudanum that had once been her escape from the harsh realities of plantation life had become her prison. Samuel had been gradually increasing the concentration of her doses for months, working with Martha to ensure that each administration was slightly stronger than the last. Margaret's tolerance had grown accordingly, but her body was reaching its limits. Soon, very soon, she would take that final step into the darkness from which there was no return. The plantation itself had begun to decay. With the governor distracted by grief and paranoia, the day-to-day operations had fallen into disarray. Crops rotted in the fields, buildings went unrepaired, and the careful order that had once defined the Blackwood estate crumbled like a house built on sand. The slave quarters, once maintained with the same attention to detail as the main house, now showed signs of neglect. Roofs leaked, walls sagged, and the small gardens that had provided supplemental food for the enslaved families grew wild with weeds. The overseers, sensing their master's weakness, had become either more brutal in their attempts to maintain control or more lax in their duties, depending on their individual natures. Samuel moved through this chaos like a ghost, still invisible, still patient, but now preparing for the final act of his 5-year symphony of vengeance. He had chosen Christmas Eve for the conclusion, finding a bitter poetry in the timing. It was, after all, a night traditionally associated with miracles and redemption, though the miracles Samuel had in mind were of a different sort entirely. The irony was not lost on him. Christmas was supposed to be a celebration of hope, of divine intervention on behalf of the innocent and oppressed. But Samuel had learned that hope was a luxury for people who still believed in justice, and divine intervention was a myth perpetuated by those who had never truly suffered. If there was to be any intervention in the affairs of the Blackwood family, it would come not from heaven, but from the very hell they had created on earth. The plan for Margaret Blackwood was elegant in its simplicity. For months, Samuel had been gradually increasing the concentration of her laudanum, working with Martha to ensure that each dose was slightly stronger than the last. Margaret's tolerance had grown accordingly, but her body was reaching its limits. On Christmas Eve, she would receive a final dose, one that would send her peacefully into the darkness. Appearing to be nothing more than an accidental overdose, by a woman whose grip on reality had been slipping for months. But Governor Blackwood would be different. Samuel had spent 5 years studying his master, learning his habits, his fears, his weaknesses. He knew that Blackwood suffered from terrible nightmares since his children's deaths, often waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat and calling out their names. He knew that the governor had taken to keeping a loaded pistol beside his bed, convinced that whoever had killed his family would eventually come for him. He was right, of course. They were coming for him, but not in the way he expected. Blackwood's paranoia had reached the point where he trusted no one completely. He had dismissed several servants on suspicion of disloyalty, had increased the number of armed guards patrolling the plantation, and had even considered moving the family to Richmond until the troubles passed. But fear had made him indecisive, and indecision had made him vulnerable. Samuel knew that Blackwood's study had become his refuge, the one place where he felt safe enough to let his guard down. It was there that he conducted his correspondence, managed his accounts, and tried to make sense of the tragedies that had befallen his family. It was also there that he kept his most private possessions, letters from his children, family portraits, and a journal where he recorded his thoughts and fears. Samuel had read that journal, of course. He had learned to pick locks years ago. Another skill acquired during his patient preparation for this moment. The journal revealed a man slowly coming apart, consumed by guilt and terror, beginning to suspect that his family's deaths were not random accidents, but part of some larger pattern of retribution. Blackwood was starting to understand on some level that his past was catching up with him, but understanding and accepting were different things, and Samuel intended to make sure that his master's final moments were filled with the complete and terrible knowledge of why he was dying. Christmas Eve arrived grey and cold, with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the main house and sent dead leaves skittering across the frozen ground. The plantation's remaining slaves went about their duties with the mechanical precision of people who had learned to survive by becoming invisible, while the main house settled into the oppressive quiet of a tomb. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Samuel performed his usual tasks, tending the fires, maintaining the buildings, ensuring that everything appeared normal, while internally counting down the hours until his long-awaited moment of reckoning. The other slaves sensed that something was different, though they couldn't have said what. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that change was coming, though whether that change would bring salvation or destruction remained to be seen. Some of the older slaves, those who remembered Samuel's family and understood the depth of his loss, watched him with knowing eyes. They said nothing, but their silence was eloquent. As evening fell, Samuel made his final preparations. He checked and rechecked every detail of his plan, ensuring that nothing had been left to chance. The rope was ready, coiled and hidden where he could retrieve it quickly. The routes through the main house had been memorized and rehearsed. The alibis were in place, the evidence prepared, the witnesses positioned. Most importantly, his own mind was ready. Samuel had spent 5 years preparing not just the practical aspects of his revenge, but the psychological ones as well. He had steeled himself for what he was about to do, accepted the moral weight of his actions, and made peace with the consequences that would follow. At 10 o'clock, Martha administered Margaret Blackwood's final dose of laudanum. The woman took it gratefully, as she had taken hundreds of doses before, seeking the chemical peace that would quiet the voices of her dead children. Within an hour, she was sleeping more deeply than she ever had before, a sleep from which she would never wake. Samuel found her body at midnight, exactly as planned. He raised the alarm with the appropriate level of distress, summoning the governor and the remaining servants to witness the tragic scene. Margaret Blackwood had simply slipped away in her sleep, another victim of the grief that had consumed the family since their children's deaths. The scene in Margaret's bedroom was one of profound sadness. She lay peacefully in her bed, her face finally free